long ago, somewhere in Africa, there was one happy kingdom.
Its trees were huge, its animals so cool. There was one happy kingdom. They had a king called Twiggle Fancy.
He's loyal big boy named Shaba. Come with me to the land of giants, hippos, lions, crocs and buffaloes.
Long ago, somewhere in Africa, there was one happy kingdom. One happy kingdom. One happy kingdom.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Stories from Magadalupsa. Magadalupsa was a great kingdom that existed in Africa many years ago. Its most famous king was King Swiggle Fancy and his favorite page boy was Shaba. My name is Alero. Today I will be telling you why children have tiny voices. Many years ago in the kingdom of Magadalupsa lived a young man known as Orhiobo. Oriable was a very talented painter who made very beautiful paintings. People often came from far and near to buy his paintings. Oriable regularly painted pictures of people. These are known as portraits. Many people would have loved to have their portraits made by Oriable, but they could not afford this because Oriable charged a lot of money to make these portraits. Only the rich and very important people could afford Oriable's paintings. Shaba, King Swiggle Fancy's favorite page boy, was strolling with the king in the gardens of the palace one evening when he told the king about Oriable.
Your Majesty, the people say there is nothing on earth that Oriable cannot paint.
Who is Oriable?
He is a painter. He does nothing else but paint. There is a long line of rich people awaiting their turn for their portraits to be made by Oriable.
That must be a very talented young man.
He is indeed very talented. In fact, I hear that there is a painting of heaven in his studio. Many people who have been there say that anyone who sees the painting has already seen heaven.
Shaba, the boy with an ear to the ground. This is very interesting. It means if I got him to paint me, I would look like the most handsome and most powerful king on earth.
You would, Your Majesty, you would. How nice it would be for Oriable to make a portrait of you.
The next day, before sunrise, two royal messengers were at Oriable's studio. Working on a painting at Oriable's studio at this time was Timmy, Oriable's son. He was 10 years old, and even though he was not a good painter, he loved to paint. He loved to watch his father paint, and whenever he had the opportunity, he would grab quickly his father's brushes and begin to paint. Unfortunately, Timmy, no matter how hard he tried, never managed to turn out good paintings. He was not a good painter.
Your presence is required at the palace of His Majesty, King Swiggle Fancy.
I don't understand you. I cannot come to the king's palace with you. I'm just 10 years old.
I can't come with you. I'm just 10 years old. Even though you are 10 years old, you should know that when King Swiggle Fancy sends for you, you must obey. Go and dress up quickly. You must look neat when you appear before His Majesty.
Timmy thought about protesting further, but changed his mind. After all, he also wanted to be important and famous like his father, Oriable. He knew that the king's messengers were mistaking him for his father, but thought to himself, perhaps the king wanted him to paint one of his children. He would put all his effort into doing so, and who knows, maybe it may even turn out to be a great painting. So Timmy dashed off to his room, wore his new shirt and a pair of trousers his father got him just the previous day, and joined the visitors in his father's studio.
I'm ready to go with you to see His Majesty.
Oriable, who had been fast asleep, was awoken by the noise coming from his studio downstairs. He was unhappy and irritated because he had worked late into the night painting the portrait of a very important man who had come from very far. When he got downstairs, he met his son, Timmy, in the company of the young messengers from King's Figure Fancy. He tried to find out what the matter was, but Timmy was not willing to tell him. Timmy simply told him that he needed to accompany the messengers somewhere and that he wouldn't be back very soon. Orhiobo was a bit worried, but he was tired and still very sleepy. So he didn't argue with his son or ask any questions. He went back to his bed to continue his sleep. At the palace, King's Figure Fancy was initially surprised to see such a little boy. He thought to himself,
He's so young, yet he has become so famous already. How is he able to make portraits of so many famous people with those little hands of his? This boy must really be a genius. Young man, your fame has spread to all parts of our kingdom and beyond. I hear your paintings are fantastic.
Well, Your Majesty, I'm just a learner, but I do hope that my paintings become fantastic as I grow older.
This impressed the king all the more, and he took on an even greater liking to the humble artist who stood before him.
I like him. He's very talented. But the talent has not gone into his head. He's still very humble.
None of King's Figure Fancy's chiefs was around at the time. Many of the palace officials were very uneasy at what was going on. Some whispered to themselves that this was not the real Orhiobo, but his son. However, seeing how impressed the king was with Timmy, they knew that they risked making him angry if they told him the truth. Nobody was bold enough to tell King's Figure Fancy the truth. Shaba, the king's favorite page boy, may have been able to tell the king the truth, but Shaba had taken ill with malaria and could not be at the palace on that day.
I want you to paint a giant, gorgeous portrait of me. I hear that you make portraits for many important people from far and near. But I want this to be the best portrait you have ever made. When can you start?
Your Majesty, I can start right now, but first I would have to go to my studio to get my tools.
Do so and return as fast as possible.
When Timmy got home, he realized that this was more serious than he had thought. King's Figure Fancy was a nice king and everyone loved him, but he was also a very powerful king and would not brook nonsense from his subjects. If he discovered that Timmy was not the great painter he thought he was, he could become very angry and maybe even send him to prison. So Timmy went to his father, Oriable.
Father, I'm sorry I lied to you.
And he narrated to his father what transpired at the king's palace. Orhiobo was initially angry with his son, but took pity on him.
Timmy, you must learn never to lie. A real man does not tell lies. If the king finds out that you deceived him, he will be very angry. So I will go in your place to make the portrait of the king.
Few hours later, Orhiobo wore the attire of a masquerade and set out for the king's palace. The king was surprised to see that the young man seemed to be much taller.
Well, maybe it's because of his costume. As a genius, I'm sure these are the little tricks he plays in order to do a great job. You are dressed like a masquerade, young man.
Yes, your majesty. When I have a very important royal assignment like yours, this is the way I dress. I want to ensure that your portrait is the best the world has ever seen.
As Oriable was an adult, even though he was covered up like a masquerade, the king would have noticed the difference between the tone of his voice and that of his 10-year-old son, Timmy. But at that time, children and adults all sounded alike. Children had deep voices like their parents, and adults.
No wonder they say you are the best. I know you are going to churn out the best painting the world has ever seen.
For the next 3 days, Oriable worked on the painting of King's Figure Fancy while the king sat on his throne dressed in his royal regalia. Regalia is the costume which a king or a queen wears, especially during ceremonies. Finally, the painting was finished. It was indeed a masterpiece. King Swigofancy was beside himself with joy.
Oh, young man, you are a great pride to our kingdom. This is indeed the finest portrait ever made. This portrait will live forever. Many years after I would have gone to join my ancestors, people will continue to admire me and remember that King Swigofancy once held sway in these lands. In a few days, I will organize a royal banquet. At that banquet, I will show the people the great work that you have done. Thank you very much for this great job. I am impressed.
Not long after, Timmy received an invitation to the royal banquet. He was happy to receive the invitation, but remembered that it was his father, Orhiobo, who actually made the king's portrait. So Timmy sent a message to King Swigofancy asking if his father could attend the royal event as well.
Oh yes, of course. Bring a masquerade costume as well.
The day of the banquet finally came, and Orhiobo, together with his son Timmy, went to the palace. The palace was agog when they got there. People were drinking and eating merrily. Mounted close to the throne of King Swigofancy was his portrait, wrapped in a lovely golden foil, like a gift fit only for a king.
Here comes the masquerade artist. It is very kind of you to come with your father.
Turning to Orhiobo, the king said,
What a talented son you have. The portrait is the best thing I have ever set my eyes on.
You are too kind, Your Majesty. Thank you for your compliments. He's just 10 years old. He will surely do greater things as he gets older.
King Swigofancy turned to Timmy.
Why don't you put on the masquerade costume? I want everyone to see how you looked while you worked on this portrait.
At this point, Timmy and his father knew that their trick had been found out. Both of them fell on their faces to the ground before the king. They begged for his mercy.
Your Majesty, please forgive us. My son Timmy is not yet as good an artist as I am. That is why I had to do the painting.
I found that out. Instead of trying to deceive me by wearing a masquerade costume, you should have simply told me and I would have understood. I am a king, and it is a big offense to try to deceive me. I will tell you your punishment after we unveil your painting.
Everybody at the ceremony exclaimed with delight when the painting was unveiled. It was gorgeous. It was the best painting anyone had ever seen in Magadalupsa. King Swigofancy, seeing how happy the painting had made his people, changed his mind about punishing Oriable and his son Timmy. Instead, he made a law that from that time on, children will speak with a tiny tone of voice, while adults will speak with a deep tone of voice.
This way, you will not be able to deceive anyone, even if you wear a masquerade costume over your body.
From then on, children in Magadalupsa began to speak in tiny voices, while adults spoke in deep voices. People from other kingdoms soon noticed that the children of Magadalupsa spoke in tiny voices and asked their own children to also speak in tiny voices. With time, children all over the world began to speak in tiny voices. Only when children grew up to become adults were they able to speak in deep voices. This is why till this day, children speak in tiny voices, their voices deepen only when they become adults.
Hi, this is Shaba. Now you know why children's voices became tiny and have remained tiny ever since.
And I'm Asayante. I certainly love my voice as it is. I'd love for it to become deeper, but not now. Only when I become an adult.
And I'm Timmy. Well, your voice is tiny because of me, but it's okay, isn't it? Who wants to have a deep voice like the adults anyway?
So now we know why children have tiny voices. Join us next time for another interesting episode of Stories from Magadelupsa.